We're delighted Larry's here, and I would invite him to the podium. Larry Goodson.
Thank you, Nick. I would begin by saying that, like Ahmed Rashid, I possess stereotypes about Maine, and because of those, I am in deep trouble with my wife, who I told she shouldn't, bother coming because it's going to be cold and snowy. And now my friends, the Jenkins, tell me that, it normally is but cold and snowy. But when I got out at Portland and the palm trees were waving and I was in a short sleeve shirt, and I called my wife back in Pennsylvania where there's a couple of feet of snow still on the ground, she was not amused. So anyway, thank you for your kind invitation to join you as you consider a region and a country that I have studied and loved for a long time, and to consider an issue that is really at the heart of U.S. foreign policy today. I've been asked to speak on U.S. military strategy in Afghanistan. I am happy to do so, but I'm still in government service, and therefore I must offer you the ritual disclaimer, namely that, and you can see it up there, picture of me in my younger days, when I used to hang out with a lot of the people that we're now busily trying to kill. But anyway, you see it up there. I'm going to say the views I express are my own and do not necessarily reflect the positions of the U.S. Army War College, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Now, at the war colleges, we teach our students that strategy is the calculated relationship between ends, ways, and means, and that strategy is to be subordinate to policy, which is a government's broad position on a particular issue. You see my own views on this slide. Politics is above everything else, but anyway. The job then of the military strategist is to apply the military tool of power in an appropriate way to execute the mission provided by the policymaker. The military is, of course, not the only tool of our national security policymakers and strategists, but generally we use the military in pursuit of vital national interests. And I have a slide on that as well. Among the most important of the other tools for the national security policymakers and strategists are diplomacy, trade, aid and development, or economics, and information, thus creating the famous acronym DIME, diplomatic, information, military, and economic tools. I mention all of this at the outset because, especially in an age of nation building and counterinsurgency, there has been a blurring of the traditional bureaucratic lines separating who wields certain tools and how those tools should be wielded. Moreover, some tools in the toolkit are more expensive and more robust. For fiscal year 2010, for example, the Department of Defense has a budget of $663.8 billion and just under 1.5 million people on active duty, while the Department of State Agency for International Development get $52.1 billion and have about 13,000 personnel. So that makes about a 10-to-1 difference in funding and a 100-to-1 difference in personnel. That also makes the military not only our most powerful, maybe sometimes our most effective, but certainly our most expensive foreign policy tool. Now, before I turn to the military strategy, I also mentioned policy, and that drives the strategy, or at least we think it should. You've got a couple of great speakers that are going to come and talk about policy, so I'm going to just put up here the current policy for Afghanistan and Pakistan according to the President of the United States. I'm not going to really talk about it. This is the white paper on U.S. policy toward Afghanistan and Pakistan, March 2009. I would note for you that the core goal of the U.S., he says, is to disrupt, dismantle, defeat al-Qaeda and its safe havens in Pakistan and prevent their return to Pakistan or Afghanistan. He uses the code language, vital to U.S. national security, and after announcing that policy, General Stanley McChrystal was appointed as the new commander, and he set about developing the new strategy in line with this policy. Now, you all know what happened next. General McChrystal's strategy was leaked to Bob Woodward at the Washington Post in September of 2009, which sparked a subsequent public, slow process of policy strategy deliberations at the White House, which culminated in President Obama's second policy statement on Afghanistan in a speech at West Point, New York, at the Military Academy at the beginning of December of last year. In that speech, again, not to really discuss it, except to say that President Obama announced that more troops would be sent to Afghanistan because our national security was at stake due to the resilience of the extremists present along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. So in that speech, he essentially endorsed the leak strategy of General McChrystal, and so I'm going to turn to that strategy now. The McChrystal strategy, I'll just call it that, is based on the notion that success in Afghanistan is achievable, but to get there, we must redefine the fight. By that, he means, I'm sorry, let me just pull up the McChrystal slide, please, the next slide. There you go. That we must turn our focus, or our military focus, to counterinsurgency, called COIN. The military loves acronyms. And I'll talk a little bit about COIN and what that is here in just a moment. That we also have to understand the criticality of time, that's what it says, criticality of time, by which he means that we have to make short-term progress, but let that set up a long-term commitment, and that we need to change the operational culture. Now that means a lot of things to the military folks. In shorthand, and I'll say more about this later, it means sort of less bombing, more cultural awareness and connection to the Afghan people. The new strategy focuses on securing the population, and it has the four major areas of emphasis that you see here. First, it calls for improving effectiveness through greater partnering with the Afghan National Security Forces. That means to increase the pace of training and mentoring of the Afghan National Army and the various Afghan police, make those forces much larger, to more than double them from their current size to 400,000 by 2011, and deploy those forces more effectively so that Afghans are eventually taking the lead in securing their own country. Now, this is where the shift to a counterinsurgency strategy comes in. COIN, if I can use the acronym, differs from more conventional military operations in that COIN is based on what they call a clear, hold, build approach, whereby forces push into an area and clear it of insurgents, then those forces or some follow-on forces hold the area so that follow-on workers can come in to build the infrastructure and provide services that will strengthen the population's connection to the government. The second major area of the strategy is to prioritize responsive and accountable governance. And this is based on the sad reality that was revealed in the electoral fiasco of the August 2009 Afghan elections that you've already heard about, which is that the Karzai government has come to be viewed widely within Afghanistan and by the international community as profoundly illegitimate. Despite widespread electoral fraud and cheating, the nature and extent of which would take too long to detail here, Karzai did not win an outright majority on the first ballot and was then humiliated by the United States into accepting a runoff, which was then made moot when his challenger, former Foreign Minister Abdullah, threw in the towel. Since then, though, President Karzai has struggled to get his cabinet nominees confirmed by the parliament, and even now 10 of those 25 or so ministries have yet to have their minister approved. This part of the strategy is critical and problematic because insurgencies are fundamentally political and cannot be defeated by a purely military effort. Thus, providing foreign forces on behalf of a government that its own people hold to be profoundly illegitimate can be a recipe for disaster, meaning that since this is the government that we are stuck with, we must try to make it better. This will be very difficult, for the Afghan government is notoriously corrupt and has performed poorly in delivering services to the people, allowing the insurgents to oppose it by presenting themselves as more capable and less corrupt. Thus, President Obama said at West Point, the days of providing a blank check are over. We will support Afghan ministries, governors, and local leaders that combat corruption and deliver for the people. We expect those who are ineffective or corrupt to be held accountable. Now, those are nice words, those are necessary words, but they are hard achievements to realize due to the localism that Dr. Azoy mentioned this morning, the narco-state structure of the Afghan political economy, and a host of other factors that I won't go into now. The third area of the strategy is maybe the most obvious military part of the strategy, and that is to gain the initiative. This refers to the contours and strength of the insurgency as it exists now. That is, we, the general public, often hear talk of the Taliban as if the Taliban is a monolithic movement, but it is far more complex than that. At least three major entities are part of the Afghan Taliban today. Those would be the Quetta Shura Taliban, which are down there at the bottom of the screen, the Haqqani Network, headed by Jalaluddin Haqqani and his son Siraj there, and Hezb-e Islami Gulbuddin, headed by the psychopath, as he was called earlier. That's basically correct. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. I was with Gulbuddin's folks in that picture you saw earlier. All of these organizations operate from sanctuary in Pakistan, where they maintain ties with Pakistani Taliban like the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan and the remnants of Al-Qaeda. These organizations also have ties with Pakistan's Inter Services Intelligence Directorate, or ISI, which has historically maintained militants as a tool of its own foreign policy to wield against India, or the Soviet Union when that country occupied Afghanistan. The different elements of the Taliban that operate in Afghanistan have grown quite strong over the past 2 to 3 years, and especially in southwestern Afghanistan, now form a shadow government that rules large swaths of the country from dusk until dawn. Thus, the insurgency has gained the initiative. I'll show you a couple of slides real quickly on this. This was from 2008. You see where a lot of the incidents are. You see in the red area the areas that the Taliban are basically holding, at least for part of the time. And then in 2009, this is not a government map. Therefore, there are folks in the government who would say it's not so bad. But in any event, it's one suggestion of an insurgency that has gained the initiative. And in the strategy, General McChrystal says he intends to gain it back. Now, to do this, for example, through the operation that's ongoing right now to take back control of Marja in northern Helmand province, he needs the forces with which to conduct conventional combat operations. He also, needs more forces with which to train more rapidly the Afghan National Security Forces. When President Obama came into office, he decided to approve a long-standing request for more forces, and in March of last year, when he announced the policy, he also announced an additional 21,000 combat forces, which, along with the support forces that came in, saw some 36,000 more troops deployed to Afghanistan by October of last year, which more than doubled what we had had there prior to that time. Then, of course, as was well documented in the newspapers, General McChrystal asked for more, and in the West Point speech, President Obama announced that another 30,000 were going to be sent over the next 6 months, so they have been flowing in already. Currently, although I know Ambassador Burns gave us a number last night, currently it is not clear to me exactly how many U.S. forces are in Afghanistan. That is because there are some 47,000 or so there as part of the NATO-led International Security Assistance Force, while perhaps another 48,000 or so are still there under Operation Enduring Freedom, which is the U.S. coalition that also exists there. There is an unknown number of additional forces engaged in other tasks, as well as private security contractors that may also be there. Now, the last piece of the strategy calls for a focusing of resources. This part of the strategy centers on connecting the foreign forces more with the population they are there to protect in numerous small but significant ways, such as reducing or eliminating the use of certain tactics associated with a higher likelihood of civilian casualties, putting more troops out among the people, and increasing the cultural and language training of the troops. This is also where the strategy calls for more civilian resources, since so much of what is deemed essential to success is properly the area of civilian components of the government. I would suggest to you, having described the strategy a bit, that there are 4 major challenges to its possible success. And I'm just going to run through those challenges very quickly. I won't actually talk about all of them in any depth, but I will this one. First, as I've already said, counterinsurgency is just one of several strategic threads that have been interwoven from the beginning of our involvement in Afghanistan. And I might add, these are threads that are hard to weave together effectively. Each strategy pursues different ends with different ways and means and takes differing lengths of time to mature. State building, or nation building, refers to the process of rebuilding the social, economic, and political institutions of a functioning state. It may be required. There's a pretty solid academic literature suggesting that it is the only way to fix failing and failed states. But the United States has no meaningful capacity to conduct state building operations in conflict zones. It's just not what we have been set up to do. Moreover, state building also takes a long time, and many Americans, like former President Bush, are extremely skeptical that such an approach represents an appropriate use of American resources. Counterterrorism. A counterterrorism approach concentrates on capturing or killing high-value targets from a list of wanted terrorists, such as the leaders of Al-Qaeda, as well as striking at their institutional structure, financial network, and safe havens. With an initial small military footprint in Afghanistan and the subsequent pace of operations in Iraq, Afghanistan became an economy of force theater where limited numbers of troops focused primarily on combat and counterterrorism operations. Now, counterterrorism requires the fewest resources, but it also attempts to achieve the least. So if killing a few bad guys doesn't solve the problem, then counterterrorism may well be the wrong strategy to adopt, although it might be a cost-effective way to kick the can down the road for later administrations to deal with. The United States started with counterterrorism. We were, after all, attacked by terrorists. And we have become unwilling to abandon counterterrorism entirely in the face of the growing strength of anti-Western militants on the Pakistani side of the Durand Line. Conventional combat operations. These are most appropriate when one military force is confronting another military force. And the United States is very good at these kinds of operations. Terrain, geography, the nature of the opponent all reduce the advantages that we normally bring to bear in conventional combat operations for the United States in Afghanistan. For combating an insurgency, which is what we have in Afghanistan, or really several insurgencies sort of all intertwined, counterinsurgency is the preferred strategy. And it is, as I said before, built on the notion that the struggle is politically and that securing the civilian population is key to the resolution of conflict. It does tend to be less sustainable over time than counterterrorism, since COIN requires a lot more troops. Thus, if it takes a long time, as it often does, domestic support back home can fade. The biggest problem with counterinsurgency is that, as I said before, if the government on whose behalf the military is conducting the counterinsurgency is generally held to be profoundly illegitimate, then COIN almost certainly cannot win. The cardinal requirement for success to the military, and I put that down at the bottom of this slide, is always the same: one leader, one plan. We are trying to weave together 4 strategies, not surprising since each strategy has serious deficiencies that the other strategic threads sort of address and try to correct. Each strategy or thread of strategy has at least one powerful bureaucratic or political patron in the current or previous administration. Now, a second challenge is that our toolkit is heavily dependent on our gold-plated military, meaning that any strategy that requires another tool will likely be under-resourced. I don't want to belabor this, but I would say that despite all the calls for a civilian surge, the United States really only has the military to accomplish the bulk of its tasks in Afghanistan. Thus, additional deployments of large numbers of U.S. personnel inevitably means mostly from the military, which suggests, to me anyway, that the only strategy likely to succeed will be one that the military is good at conducting. So if what you really need to do is state building, you might not be so successful in Afghanistan. Third, Afghanistan was a central playing field for what was known in the 19th century as the Great Game between the British and Russian empires. Today, it is the centerpiece of a 21st century geopolitical great game between Russia, China, India, Iran, Pakistan, and, since the fall of 2001, the United States. All of these actors are engaged in pursuing their own national interest in Afghanistan, often through the time-honored tools of war by proxy and diplomacy by intrigue, making it very difficult for us to leave, especially since our reputation for staying power is pretty poor in this part of the world to begin with. Now, I don't have much time, and I can't really do justice to the complexity of the geopolitical environment in a few short sentences, so I'll just give you a quick taste of the problem. Pakistan and India, of course, we heard about this morning, have a long-standing rivalry that dates back to the partition of the subcontinent and their beginnings in 1947. China and India, both aware that through sheer size were fated to compete for dominance of Asia, became continental rivals by the early 1960s. The split between China and the Soviet Union that developed at the same time led the Soviet Union, now Russia, to become a close friend of India's, while China and Pakistan developed a strategic partnership of their own. The Soviet Union, of course, collapsed by the end of 1991, less than 3 years after its own long war in Afghanistan, which allowed the Soviet Central Asian republics to the north of Afghanistan to achieve their independence. Some of those new countries have significant natural resources, and China, India, and a resurgent Russia all want access to those resources. Afghanistan is in the middle of this competition, once again a crossroads, as it has been so often before in its history. The great game, however, the modern great game, not only applies in Afghanistan. China's string of pearls maritime strategy, which you see up here, the red crosses are the Chinese littoral bases, and the black squares and rectangles are the Indian ones. This strategy has been augmented by its development of Pakistani infrastructure and Afghanistan's copper mine. And of course, I'm talking specifically in Pakistan about the port of Gwadar, which is a little actually further to the west of that cross, while India has been pursuing its own Indian Ocean strategy through port building in Iran and road building in Afghanistan. And I'm going to take a second to emphasize this because it's not on this map. India refurbished the Iranian port of Chabahar right here, so they have, for all the military folks in the audience, outflanked the Chinese, at this point anyway. And then they built the road up to Zaranj and over to Delaram. And so they've now got a way into Afghanistan that goes around Pakistan. and a port that goes beyond the Chinese-funded port of Gwadar. Russia's in this too. Russia's efforts to resurge in Central Asia allow for, among other things, a so-called northern distribution network for supplies to get into Afghanistan. Now, let me just say a quick word about this. Afghanistan is at the bottom of a barrel from a logistical point of view. Currently, some 80% of US and NATO supplies cross Pakistani territory. This is okay, of course, because Pakistan is a major non-NATO ally of the United States, but it's not okay because Pakistan also has a serious Islamist militancy problem that has not been able to control. In fact, I would argue at great length, if it was the subject of my speech and I wasn't coming to the end of my time, that Pakistan is a far more significant challenge for US foreign policy than is Afghanistan, and that Pakistan's internal contradictions provide enormous complications for our Afghanistan strategy. In the interest of time, I'll skip over that and the slide that lays all of that out for you. But I will leave you with, on this subject, the big geopolitical question. I realize we have Nick Burns here, so he can't answer this question, but I'll leave it for the rest of you. If the 21st century great game of Asia is shaping up to be a struggle between China, Pakistan, the Gulf Arabs, sort of on one side, and India, Iran, Russia, sort of on the other, then which side is the United States on? We're in the region, so it's not like we can say, oh, we don't take side. No, we're in the region. Anyway, the geopolitics may say stay for the American public, but of course, as we heard earlier, the clock is ticking, and public support for the Afghan campaign is even shakier in many of our partner countries of NATO. Announcing a timetable for planned withdrawal of combat forces responds to that clock, but as we heard this morning, there are multiple audiences that received the signal, not all of whom are looking at the clock. In his West Point speech, President Obama said, there are those who oppose identifying a time frame for our transition to Afghan responsibility. Indeed, some call for a more dramatic and open-ended escalation of our war effort, one that would commit us to a nation-building project of up to a decade. I reject this course because it sets goals that are beyond what can be achieved at a reasonable cost and what we need to achieve to secure our interest. Now, as I suggested in an earlier slide, politics drive everything, or so it seems to me. And everyone understands that the folks in office at the moment want to see some measure of success prior to the next round of elections. But how do we achieve that rapid success in those areas of strategy that take a longer time period to ripen? And what about the enemy, the guys without the clocks? If we tell them that we plan to draw down forces in Afghanistan, conditions permitting, in the summer of 2011, what strategy do they then pursue? Well, in truth, and to sort of conclude, any strategy for Afghanistan will be extremely difficult to implement successfully unless success is defined very narrowly and we hasten for the exit as soon as we can reasonably claim to have succeeded. Throughout history, Afghanistan has seen many invaders as people for thousands of years crossed this famous land bridge of Central Asia. Since Alexander the Great's invasion in 330 BC, not one great power that has since entered Afghanistan succeeded in its strategy there, with the exception of Genghis Khan in the 1220s, who basically killed everybody, which I don't personally see as a good strategy, at least anymore. Afghanistan has since earned the nickname Graveyard of Empires because great powers get drawn in there, usually on the road to somewhere else or in order to prevent another country from controlling the area, and then the invading great power fails, often losing its status in the aftermath. The most recent great power to fail in Afghanistan, I have it up there on the slide, was the former Soviet Union. By the 8th year of its war there, the Soviets found themselves faced with all of those problems, all of which exist now in the 8th year of the US involvement in Afghanistan. Of course, there are key differences too, as President Obama noted in his West Point speech, in regards to comparing Afghanistan to Vietnam. And I don't wish to give you a simple comparative analogy, but I also don't wish to ignore the lessons of history. Perhaps Afghanistan is a graveyard of empires, or perhaps it is a failed state whose rescue could transform the international system. Either way, the United States faces a conundrum there, which put simply is this: we cannot afford to stay, and we cannot afford to go. I always try to reference The Clash whenever I can in these speeches. For the younger folks in the audience, you might remember the Sandinista album. Thus, our strategy is aimed at reaching, it seems to me, a measurable amount of success in a short period of time, and then get most of our combat forces out. This is the old declare victory and get out before anyone can prove otherwise approach. If our opponents cooperate, and after all, they want us out and can spin our leaving into their victory as easily as we can call it their defeat, this strategy might work. There is high risk, however, as the historical record for great powers in Afghanistan and in long counterinsurgencies in general is very poor. And although I've run into overtime, I'll give you this last thought because it's very important to me. 3 very good Afghan specialists, you should have invited these 3 people to this conference, except they're in Afghanistan, who are well known to the other people on the program, have all argued to me within the past 3 months that the war in Afghanistan is lost and that the United States should disengage as soon as possible. I disagree that the war is lost. I believe we cannot afford to lose it. But I cannot see how we can be successful as the bully boys for a deeply corrupt and ineffective Afghan government while our own population becomes increasingly uncertain about whether our ends, ways, and means match up appropriately in Afghanistan. I may have left you with more questions than I provided answers, but I thank you for the invitation and your attention. Let me just